Hi, class. As you all know, your final assignment in Western Civ this semester is to write a paper based on the film Battle of Algiers. I want you all to watch the movie Battle of Algiers. I've given you some reading assignments on it, which are pretty short, actually. And also, I assigned a documentary film on the Battle of Algiers. It's 5 parts. I've given you 3 parts of it. I'll give you the last 2 parts of it, too, to help the movie to help put the Battle of Algiers in context. Although the Battle of Algiers really, the movie itself really focuses on, say, the first 3 years. The entire Algerian War of Independence goes on from 1954 to 1962. The Battle of Algiers really focuses on 1954 to 1957, looking at the actual war that focused on what happened in the city of Algiers, in particular in the settler part of the city and the Casbah, which was the indigenous community composed of Arabs and Berbers, the Kabyle-speaking people who are considered to be the indigenous Algerians. Although in reality, there's a significant overlap between Kabyles and Arabs. I mean, basically, most of the Arabs in Algeria are Berbers who ended up culturally becoming Arabs, although there is a bit of a differentiation there, but that's kind of getting beside the point. Anyway, you all may be wondering, why is it that this is the final assignment? Well, really, the Algerian War of Independence is probably one of the greatest, most significant historical events of the latter part of the 20th century. And it tends to be under the radar for Americans because it did not directly involve the United States. The United States was not fighting in the Algerian War. Obviously, the United States was a Western country and supported France, but it wasn't directly involved. Although, if you look at things, the United States ended up in Vietnam because France got defeated in Vietnam and really focused on Algeria. And of course, Vietnam ended up being a huge game changer in American history. And also, I would argue that a lot of the dynamic in Middle Eastern history, in North African history, and in Muslim history in the 20th century and the 21st century was shaped by the Algerian War of Independence. Now, the reason I say that is that, as you all know from the film and from the book, the French came into Algeria in 1830 under the leadership of Charles X. This was after Napoleon had been defeated, the revolution was over. There had been long-standing tensions between the European side of the Mediterranean and the North African side of the Mediterranean over raids. Now, back in the old days, both sides raided each other and enslaved each other. But over time, raiding became much more something done on the North African side. And as the film mentions, as one of the first part of the documentary mentions, there had been an incident in which the Algerian leader, the Bey of Algiers, slapped the French official. This was seen as a great insult. And eventually the French came and occupied Algeria. Now, what happened was that the French occupied the coastal part of Algeria, but really the interior of Algeria, and this is something that wasn't made so clear in the video, really did not become pacified until around 1880 to 1880 to 1882 in that area. It took a long time to pacify the interior. Although in real terms, the great majority of people of European origin, the Pied Noirs, or Blackfeet, that was Blackfeet. That was the term used for European immigrants to Algeria. The great majority of them lived pretty close to the coast because the area north of the Atlas Mountains was the part of Algeria that got decent rainfall and was good for farming. You could pretty much live, basically it was the same kind of climate except for warmer that you had on the northern side or the European side of the Mediterranean. Once you got south of the Atlas Mountains, you really got into the Sahara, much drier, much hotter. an environment where you really could not have a European-style farming. And so eventually, Europeans become 10% of the population. And this is very interesting because basically Algeria becomes pretty much like South Africa. I mean, South Africa eventually became a settler colony with a significant minority of Europeans living there. Algeria did the same thing. Now at its peak, South Africa would actually be about 20% people of European extraction, or whites, if you want to use that term. Now, in the case of Algeria, the population of Europeans was about 10%. Now, obviously, the racial difference is strong there. Many of the Algerians were just as fair as Europeans. Some of them were a bit darker. You actually have a minority of black Algerians, but by and large, Algeria is not a black country. It's an African country, but it's not a black country. However, although race is not really an issue in Algeria, religion is an issue because, as the film says, native Algerians could not become French citizens unless they renounced the Sharia, unless they renounced Islamic law. And for Muslims, this was not possible. I mean, if they believed their faith, they believed they were committing a really significant sin by renouncing Sharia. Now, some people did that and became citizens and became pretty well off. You had some minorities in Algeria that were not Muslim that were able to do that. I mean, like, for instance, you had a Jewish minority that lived in Algeria at that time. You don't really have them there anymore now. Most of those people left after the war. But, they were able to, become French citizens because, they didn't have to renounce Sharia. But renouncing Sharia was something that just simply was a bridge that the great majority of Algerians, indigenous Algerians, they could not accept that. And so as a result, they were always on the outside. Now, what the film shows is that these people understood that they were under control, that they were not in a position to really fight against the colonists. And they don't really start rising up until the period around World War II. The French are defeated, very quickly in World War II. The Vichy regime, which is basically a puppet regime of the Nazis, they take over. And, you do see a revolt of Algerians against the French, in the aftermath of World War II. That's very brutally put down. Because what we see is that the French, they really undergo kind of a identity crisis. I mean, they were defeated badly by the Germans in World War I. I mean, they weren't really defeated badly by the Germans in World War I, but the great majority of World War I was fought on French territory. In World War II, the French were decisively defeated by the Germans because the French had a really bad military strategy. And the Germans were able to quickly overcome them and defeat them. And so what this meant was that after the war was over, you had the French, and to a certain degree, the British also, they were conscious of the fact that they were no longer the major powers in the world. America and the Soviet Union had become the two major powers. It was become two superpowers. It was a struggle between communism and capitalism. The old colonial empires were really kind of on the side. And what you have in Algeria is not exactly a fight between communism and capitalism, although the French, although there were Marxists among the Algerians, and the FLN, the National Liberation Front. FLN is like the Front Liberation Nationale, if you want to say it in French. They had a Marxist influence. They had a strong revolutionary influence, but also they were not communists in the sense of that you would have had in China or that you had in the Soviet Union. I mean, these people still have very, very strong ties to their traditional Islamic culture. And they really, just wanted their country to be independent. They wanted a nationalist government. But at the same time, since the French had a large settler population there, over 1 million people. At that time, Algeria was about 10 million people. 1 million of them were Europeans. The Europeans were about 10% of the population. They were not quick to want to leave. These people had been established there. They wanted to stay there. And so as a result, you end up with a really nasty war. As you can see from the movie Battle of Algiers, both sides were willing to use techniques that could be considered terrorism. Algerians, were willing to bomb cafes. Europeans were willing to go into the Casbah and drop bombs. There was a great deal of torture in order to get people to talk. And, both sides, were willing to deal with massacres of the other side in order to get their way. Now, the interesting thing about the Battle of Algiers, like I said, focuses on 1954 to 1957. And the French, because they are ruthless, especially when the paratroopers come in, they're very rough and tough. They are able to pretty much shut down the rebellion in the city. At the end of the movie where the leaders of the movement are caught and blown up, that does largely end the rebellion in the city. However, the revolution continues in the countryside. Unlike y'all have seen pictures in the films of some of the really bloody killings that went on in the countryside. That continued. And what we see is that eventually the Algerian War eventually puts a great deal of pressure on France itself. Ultimately, you have the paratroopers, the military elite in France who don't want to lose another war. They're willing to keep fighting, even if it means destroying French democracy, even if it means having a military dictatorship. Something kind of like, for instance, in Southern Europe at this time, in Southwestern Europe, in Portugal and Spain, you have military dictatorships down there that lasted until the 1970s. The dictatorship of General Francisco Franco and the dictatorship in Portugal. These lasted until the 1970s. There was a certain willingness in France for people to have that kind of government because they did not want to see France continually lose. Also, the Pied Noir, the settlers in Algeria, they had been there for a few generations. Their livelihoods, everything they owned was in Algeria. They were willing to go in the direction of terrorism and essentially fascism in order to hold on to power. And so the significant thing about the war is that eventually by 1958, after the Fourth Republic of France, which was established after the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, it collapses. And the Fifth Republic, a republican system that is still in place now. The Fifth Republic is the government of France right now, in which you have a much stronger presidency. And the first president of the Fifth Republic was General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of France during World War II, the military leader and hero of World War II. He becomes the leader. And de Gaulle realizes that France cannot continue to hold on to the empire. But he also wants France to have the influence. Now, what he realizes is that Algeria, the war in Algeria has become so nasty and so bitter that he has to let it go. He has to let Algeria go. And so what you see is that Charles de Gaulle ends up negotiating with the French territories. French had a huge amount of colonies in Africa. Francophone Africa, was all in Western, was in Western and Central Africa, and also a bit in East Africa. And so de Gaulle negotiated with countries like Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, Ivory Coast, or Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Congo Brazzaville, a republic, or Congo, he negotiates with all these countries. And except for Guinea, which was led by Sekou Touré, who also was very strongly Marxist influenced. Except for Guinea, he was able to cut deals with all these countries and maintain French influence. And so eventually what we see is that under de Gaulle's leadership, the French are willing to pull out of Algeria by 1962, and Algeria gets its independence. And France is able to maintain a great deal of influence in Africa to this day. To this day, you have French troops in places like Mali in Africa. You have French troops in places like Niger in Africa to this day. And so France to this day still has huge influence in Africa. But they pulled out of Algeria. They realized that the conflict in Algeria had become too bitter. I mean, ultimately about 2 million Algerians died in the war. I mean, 2 million people died in 8 years. That's a very, very, very bloody war. And tens of thousands of Europeans are killed also. And so de Gaulle, he negotiates this exit in 1962. Now, what happens is that the Pied Noir, they have to leave. However, they're very bitter. Like the film mentions the OAS, which, it becomes a very radical right-wing organization. And what we see is that, the modern day National Front in France, which is a very right-wing, political party, still exists. The founder of that party was a Pied Noir member and a military member who fought in Algeria. His daughter still runs the party to this day. And it's very significant because right now you have a significant rise in the right wing in Europe. And to a certain degree, the National Front Party of France really was a prototype of the modern European right wing. And so from that standpoint, the Battle of Algiers is really significant in that this movie really shows the influence of decolonization in French politics. Right now, France has the largest Muslim population of any European country. And much of that population stems from Algerians who fought on the side of the French, who moved to France. And then also you had other Algerians who just moved later on because, France was the European country they knew. And so, so France to this day still has this great tie to Algeria, although they had this very, very bitter war. The French right wing, to this day still has its origins due to the Algerian War. And, if you look at modern Europe right now, there's a great deal of back and forth and a great deal of frustration over immigration from Africa. I mean, like in America, people talk about the southern border. Well, in Europe, the southern border is the Mediterranean. And on the other side of the Mediterranean is Africa. And so you have both people, constantly trying to come into Europe from Africa. And, once again, this is a byproduct of colonialism, of the colonization of Africa. And when the war and when colonization ends, these people have learned about European culture. They speak European language. They speak French or English. They want to go to Europe. They know that that's the richer part of the world, and they want to go there. And Africa's right next door to Europe. And so Algeria really is an important conflict from that standpoint, in that it really kind of sets the stage for so many things you see in the news today. And so that's really why I want to end up focusing on this conflict. And also, if you think about it, if you look at what America has been involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan just ended in August after 18 or so years. And the war in Iraq ended, several years earlier. so much of the conflict that went on there looks exactly like what happened in Algeria a couple of generations earlier. And so really, we see that even though America was not involved in the Algerian War, it's informed what's happened. I mean, even if you pay attention to the movie, they show the helicopters. I mean, the helicopters that the Americans used were very much influenced by the way the French used them. And so from that standpoint, the Algerian War really did kind of serve as a harbinger of what would come in the 20th century. Well, anyway, I hope this is helpful to you. If you all need any more information, don't hesitate to email me. I'm also going to post another lecture, not my lecture, but a lecture that a guy gave at Yale that I think also is very helpful for the Algerian War too. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope it helps you with your assignment. Take care.